the committee and also of the department faculty, I'd like to welcome you to UNC and also to this colloquium circle, which has become a tradition of the department to allow conversations, with scholars from various disciplines from around the Triangle area. The title of Dr. Carter's talk today is The Overwhelming Event and Black Testimony from the Immanent Divine. Dr. Youssef Carter is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Kenan Rifai Fellow in Islamic Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill. He works at the intersections of anthropology, religious studies, and Black studies. And he analyzes how Muslims in the United States and in West Africa interpret their religion as a means of empowerment in the face of oppression, while relying on scripture and prophetic narration to navigate hostile political realities. To that end, he is writing a book called, I quote, "The Vast Oceans, Remembering God and Self on the Mustafawi Sufi Path," unquote, which is a multi-site ethnography of a transatlantic spiritual network of African-American and West African Sufis that deploy West African spiritual training to navigate historical political context in the US South and beyond. For the past few years, Dr. Carter has also led a small editorial team for an online magazine project, Voyages Africana Journal, and has just been added to the editorial team of the Journal of Africana Religions. In addition to these projects and others, he serves as an advisory board member of the After Malcolm Digital Archive, sponsored in part by the Ali Vural Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University, which chronicles the oral histories of African-American Muslims and serves as a repository for digitized historical documents, newspapers, and memorabilia related to their involvement in the Black freedom struggle from 1965 onward. With that, I'll just welcome Professor Carter to begin his talk.
Thank you, Samba, for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank the organizers at the African Studies Center, as well as the AAAD department, that is the African and African American Diaspora, African Diaspora Studies Department at UNC, for allowing me to share some thoughts and reflections with you today. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And while I do that, I trust that one of my other co-hosts will admit people who are in the waiting room into the presentation. Let's see. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Within the past year, two prominent hip hop artists, that is Kanye West and Electronica, released albums that were informed by their respective religious beliefs. Aside from this is the remarkable fact that both albums articulate visions for redemption, uplift, and freedom. Although tethered to notions of economic and political domination via kingship, and throne seeking. And so here I want to offer a reflection on the varying tensions therein regarding race, religion, and freedom. Through a critical reading of the respective visions for liberation and personal growth, shared through lyrics and sonic production, I also want to analyze, if I can, the theological ground upon which these collections of work are built in hopes of better understanding what broader implications they have regarding uplift and Black futurity. My aim, therefore, is not to analyze each album in depth, we don't have time to do that, but rather to consider what role testimony plays in the context of this collective theological soundscape. As well, rather than understand the emergence of these two albums as a consequence of this specific historical moment, I also consider these works as the latest iterations of each artist's broader respective discographies.
Waste any time. I asked the question, who are the real children of Israel? And I'd like to answer it right away.
Go ahead, you understand.
Like any good lawyer in a courtroom, he tells you what he's going to prove.
All right.
And then he goes ahead and proves it and let the jury make the decision. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad has said that Almighty God Allah revealed to him that the black people of America are the real children of Israel. And we are the choice of God. And that unto us he will deliver his promise.
Jay Electronica's 2020 album, released back in March, entitled A Written Testimony, opens with a symphonic bass line upon which the words of Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam describes Black people, his people, as the real children of Israel, just as revealed through the guidance of Elijah Muhammad. Again, while I won't recount the details of each song, I would like to point out that his first track, Jay Electronica's first track, is called The Overwhelming Event. Named after the 88th chapter of the Quran, which is Surah Al-Ghashiyah, which succinctly outlines the treatment of the inhabitants of the hellfire and the inhabitants of the paradise in the afterlife, Jay Electronica stitches together at once the exegetical force of an NOI political theology, buoyed by a specific tradition of Black protest with that of an Islamic eschatology to which the entire Muslim Ummah ascribes. This theopolitical mashup continues thematically throughout the entire body of work. In English, the latter 6 verses of Surah Al-Ghashiyah read as follows. So remind them, truly you are only a reminder. You have no control over them. But he who turns away and covers up the truth, Allah shall punish him with the most dire punishment. Truly unto us is their return. Then upon us is their reckoning. As throughout the Quran, this message distinguishes between the believers and unbelievers, and yet articulates the Prophet Muhammad's role as one tasked with being the human vessel through which humanity is warned of an inevitable divine judgment. This Quranic reference, when injected into this musical context, suggests the divine task that Jay Electronica is given from upon high, that his mission is to remind his listeners through his music of a great and inevitable reckoning that will separate the wicked from the devout, and by extension, the just from the unjust. In somewhat similar fashion, Jay Electronica playfully declares himself imbued with otherworldly authorial ability. In the second verse of the second track, entitled The Ghost of Soldier Slim, Jay Electronica proclaims, if it come from me and Hove, that is Jay-Z, consider it Quran. If it come from any of those, consider it haram. The minaret that Jigga built me on the dome of the rock was crafted so beautifully, consider the Sudan. From a hard place in Iraq to the rock nation of Islam. The song opens again relying on the impassioned words of Minister Louis Farrakhan as he warns the so-called scared to death Negroes to quote unquote, sit down and shut up and not to quote unquote, defend our enemies. The song's title refers to or references a slain rapper from New Orleans, Soulja Slim, who was gunned down in front of his own house. Like too many others such as Biggie, Tupac, and Nipsey, the parable of Magnolia Slim's violent departure back in 2003 stands as an entry point for Jay-Z and Jay Electronica to speak on their behalf in the vacuous silence of their stolen bodies, as they suggest a reckoning, whether immediate or eventual, for those opposed to Black artistic success. Considering that Jay Electronica is from New Orleans, his reference also suggests a nod to the manner in which disregard for Black life contributed to the hypervulnerability of lower Ninth Ward residents during Hurricane Katrina and thereafter. The ghosts that were produced from the structural violence of racial geography might now speak from the golden mouths of unholy disciples, evidence of a reckoning witnessed and then etched into the washed out eyes of the neglected dead, whose swollen bodies were engorged by floodwaters. Perhaps not the intention of Jay Electronica and Jay-Z, considering its date of release earlier this year. This articulation of stolen bodies via federal neglect underscores the violent rupture experienced by too many families, reeling and dismembered through an omnipresent environmental racism and state-sponsored terrorism in the midst of the global coronavirus pandemic. Much to the surprise of fans who anxiously awaited the album, Jay-Z, partial owner and co-founder of Roc Nation Records, through which the album is produced, has a quite prominent place as a featured rapper on the majority of the songs in the album. While the first voice we hear on the album is that of Minister Louis Farrakhan, the second is Jay-Z. Jay-Z's articulation of the divine is surely informed by his own inclusion in the 5% nation, that is the nation of gods and earths, who maintain that the Black man is both literal God and original man, that is, Black people are fathers and mothers of civilization. This theology was originally conceived by its founder in 1964 after a dispute while a member of the Nation of Islam. Clarence 13X, right, determines that the sort of 10% of people rule over and attempt to keep 85% of people ignorant of the truth, while the remaining 5%, hence 5%ers, know the truth and work to steer humanity toward proper knowledge and enlightenment. From his earliest days as a rapper, Jay-Z was mentored by and associated with the 5%ers. Considering that Jay-Z has a heavy presence in almost every song on the album, A Written Testimony, this is not unlike his self-identification as quote-unquote hip-hop savior on his 2006 song, Kingdom Come. In fact, the opening lyrics of a 2013 song entitled Heaven from his Magna Carta Holy Grail album, Jay-Z raps, arm, leg, arm, head, spelling out the name Allah, right? This is God body, knowledge, wisdom, freedom, understanding, we just want our equality. Food, clothing, shelter, help a man find some peace. Happiness for a gangster, ain't no love in these streets. Conspiracy theorists screaming Illuminati, they can't believe this much skill is in the human body. Triumphant and pregnant with Islamic references, Jay Electronica's entire album moons with an unapologetic Blackness couched in the vocabulary of Islamic devotion. At the same time, it is enveloped within an ontology of struggle with an eye ever focused on the come up. On the sixth song, entitled Universal Soldier, Jay Electronica recites the Shahadatain, right, which is the dual testimony of Islamic faith after seeking refuge in Allah from the Satan, which we can presume is identified as a warmongering American empire that has fueled its project of manifest destiny through its persistent consumption for Black and Asian flesh. At its outset, we hear a voice naming the flight crew responsible for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima during World War II, as an intro to his recitation in which he voices the primary pillar of his Muslim faith as precursor to his own lyrics. In Afro-Asiatic Black fashion, Jay Electronica's testimony suggests an international solidarity in which the technological assault that results in the obliteration of some of Hiroshima's citizens and otherwise melted the flesh of others beyond the immediate blast zone is somehow connected to the ontological terror experienced by enslaved Africans, as well as deeply recognizable in the pained breath that has been choked from countless Black Americans throughout American history, Muslims included. It tells us perhaps that the constant subjugation that marks Black life has produced in them mental and spiritual fortitude that renders them hyper-resistant to weakness and prone to endurance as they continually seek to occupy an earthly throne. Moreover, even the ability to engage in spiritual warfare is, in spite of constant devilry, is a superhuman feat, if not an otherworldly one. J. Electronica says, "The son of slaves, true, I started out as a peasant. That's why I built my temple like Solomon in the desert. Lord is my rock, I speed dial to Salah. My poetry is living like the God that I fall back on, and all praise is due to Allah for such an illustrious platform. The teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is my backbone." It's quite apparent that this political theology, which underscores the album's creative thrust, is a Black Islam. That is, Islam as practiced and shaped from within a long-standing vernacular of liberation on the part of Black American Muslims in response to and in light of collective historical trauma and structural racism. This political theology of liberation has partly been the result of a specific exegetical reinscription of religious doctrine and practice, out of which emerged the variegated Black American Muslim movements and institutions that were initiated in the earliest decades of the 20th century and persist up to the present. A written testimony was released again back in March of 2020, this year, as the continual impact of racial genocide via police murder was then compounded by the onset of the global coronavirus pandemic, which also impinges on Black life especially. And so I want to ask, what does the utterance of Arabic terminologies in the context of Jay's album achieve, right? What does testimony in this case offer, right? And so in trying to consider the role of testimony in Jay Electronica's album, I wonder how the utilization of Black Muslim language provides the speaker with a forceful vernacular from which to articulate power and uplift. At a grassroots rally at King Solomon Baptist Church in Detroit, that is November 1963, Malcolm X gave what would be his last speech as national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam before his official departure from the organization. Popularly known as Message to the Grassroots, Malcolm articulated a direct analogy that quite sharply cleaved the political imaginary field in two halves, right? One, gradualist and assimilatory in its approach regarding race relations, and the other, uncompromising and exacting in its desire to eradicate the colonial grasp of global white supremacy. Malcolm's political imagination framed those that aligned themselves with the oppressor and sought to integrate into the white American political framework as house Negroes, while those who desired to eradicate the plantation paradigm entirely were field Negroes. It was through this analogy that Malcolm critiqued the willingness of civil rights leaders to aim for what he felt was placation and compromise and gradualism. Perhaps a bit unfair, but he understood it as an approach that ultimately served to leave the plantation intact, even if it agreed to dispense rights at the discretion of the oppressor. In October of 2019, last year, Kanye West released his 9th studio album entitled Jesus is King, to much acclaim and not without controversy. While Jay Electronica was thought of as an elusive rap prodigy whose fans had waited too long in anticipation of a full album, Kanye was busy making a public spectacle of his impromptu conservative rants, bad takes concerning supposed impotency of resistance amongst enslaved peoples, and awkward ramblings about not receiving proper recognition for his creative genius. To many, it appeared that he was somehow pained and unraveling in real time. Again, in the midst of his public appearances, Kanye's album release offered itself as a testimony of the most recent shift in his religious outlook. He was more devout and wanted to invite his listeners to an enlightened pathway to a righteous life. However, the din of his gospel caused many to question his intentions in the face of his quest to market the album to an excited fan base, and aligned himself with white conservative evangelists like Joel Osteen in doing so. I raise these points merely because it is important to contextualize the political theology of his music alongside his public movements. Yet before I comment on his political theology, I want to briefly analyze its soundscape.
LA, are you ready to sing with us? Well, it's time to sing till the joy come down. It's time to sing till the power come down. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Come on. Hey, we about to sing. Come on. Hey, hey, hey. Put your hands together like this. Hey. One big church. One big choir. Here we go. I know you got the record. Come on, sing with us. Sing.
Sing till the power of the Lord comes down. Sing till the power of the
And so in his album, Jesus is King, Kanye immediately surrounds listeners with his Sunday service choir sound as we are given a blend of bright, airy, and triumphant voices. I have to admit that it took me a couple of listens to actually begin to appreciate the album's sonic vibe and fully step into its joyful noise. I have to also admit that part of me is drawn to the first track in particular, entitled Every Hour, this one that I just played for you, as it offers me a nostalgia that takes me back to my childhood days accompanying my family on Sunday service at the North Stelton African Methodist Episcopal Church in central New Jersey. For many Black Christians, I suspect that this arrangement feels familiar, albeit instrumentally rendered into the gospel vision of Kanye West. Worship and praise music, quickened, redeemed, and packaged for consumption en masse. This isn't the only nostalgic aspect of the song, however. For those of us who harken back to the quote-unquote old Kanye days, when his snarky and egotistical rhymes seemed harmless against his fresh soul sample beats, his theology seems a bit troubling, especially since, depending on who you ask, certain aspects potentially feel like an extension of the Kanye persona, or what we know of as the Kanye persona. That is self-concerned, materialistic, misogynistic, vulgar, violent, and now self-righteous. The entire album does not sound like this, but I do rely on this particular arrangement as an entry point in mining his musical and lyrical arrangements in order to better understand his testimony and potentially draw conclusions in light of this moment in his prior catalog. Kanye's most recent display of faith is worthy of unpacking by itself. However, it should be understood in light of the celebratory framing of Trump's presidency. Roughly 2 weeks before the release of his album back in October, Kanye, that is last year, Kanye visited the Oval Office to show public support of Donald Trump. He even embraced Trump while wearing a MAGA hat, right? While warning the so-called liberals should be more mindful of how their constant focus on Trump's mishaps risks making the country look bad. Here we see a full embrace of the gospel of an Americanism that perhaps too comfortably fellowships with that of white nationalist politics. Kanye's seeming embrace of American ethos runs counter to the critical lens on American domestic and international politics, voiced through Jay Electronica's album. And so in the second track of Kanye's gospel, entitled Selah, he exclaims, "God is king, we the soldiers. When I get to heaven's gates, I ain't gotta peek over. Before the flood, people judged. They did the same thing to Noah." Further, he says, "Won't be in bondage to any man." John 8:33, "We were the descendants of Abraham, ye should be made free." John 8:36, "To whom the Son set free is free indeed. He saved a wretch like me." Now, something about his testimony seems a bit too manufactured, I think. Perhaps his claim to an already achieved salvation and claims of faithful redemption were uttered a bit too hastily. His testimony seems to lack the evidence of a life devoted to humble reflection. That is, it does not seem to carry any resemblance to an ego broken and torn asunder in the face of an inward reckoning. After all, what value is a path to righteousness that does not require sincere transformation? What good is a word not adequately digested in the heart of the speaker? That is, it seems, from the outside looking in, of course, Kanye too quickly and too brazenly claims triumph and salvation while offering that testimony to his listeners. I also wonder if this project entirely isn't just another capitalist exercise. I'll pause here to mention that each member of his Sunday service choir in that clip was draped head to toe in Kanye's trademark clothing. I'll leave that there though. Anyway, throughout his album, Kanye mentions things about can't let my family starve, right? Wanting to abolish the 13th Amendment, that being on him, right? Especially in reference to and this possibly being a reference to chattel enslavement and potentially hyper incarceration, right? He also suggests a critique of the Christian church, right? A kind of unhousing, a kind of invalidation of ecclesiastical authority. Throughout the album, we see this sort of deployment of African-American religiosity, right? A kind of Black gospel grammar. He mentions something about breaking down all the prisons, all of the idols, letting them go, right? Speaking of idols, we should ask, who is the Jesus that Kanye envisions? And what is exactly is the nature of his kingship, right? Is it a white, American, capitalist, MAGA Jesus, right? We can also think about the way in which this sort of theological vision might be an extension of Kanye's obsession with inhabiting the throne. Is this some kind of anti-revolutionary prosperity gospel rap? Is it mumble theology? right? Not in the sense of, actually mumbling or speaking in tongues, but rather the sort of improvisational nature of it. This is also the way in which we can sort of think about this sort of resistance to slave ship that he articulates. But unfortunately, much like Jay-Z, this occurs through, or is envisioned through a capitalist domination, this sort of grammar of conquest, right? He talks about being part of this sort of army of God, and we are the soldiers. Also, is this conservative theology a convenient and half-baked pivot to accommodate a white public who will consume his performance of Black gospel music? Furthermore, is he an actual believer in the American vision of capitalist progress? Even if Kanye's Jesus is not white, even if Kanye's Jesus is Black, right? Considering he pulls part of his grammar from a Black gospel tradition, featuring Fred Hammond on the album, for example, then perhaps we might call him a sunken place Jesus. And if this is too harsh, fine, but it's definitely, I don't think, an immigrant Jesus, definitely not a kick the money changers out of the temple Jesus. If I sound a bit removed or cynical when discussing Kanye's current theological framing, maybe it is partly because it wasn't too long ago that he released an album back in 2013 entitled Jesus, in which songs like Black Skinhead and New Slaves accompany his song, I Am a God, that elicited critical reactions from other rap artists. J. Cole, for example, released the song False Prophets in order to chronicle his own ambivalence and frustration regarding Kanye's narcissism. He describes how he held Kanye up as a genius, and to witness what appears to be an emotional and psychological fracture in public manner was hurtful for him. J. Cole also takes this event as a lesson about a broader trend of investing too much trust and too much faith in popular artists. Similar to the concern of J. Cole, Odyssey, a Muslim rapper of Sudanese and African-American heritage, released a song in 2013 entitled Jesus Was a Mortal Man. Now, the song's self-explanatory title suggests how Odyssey feels about the prospect of Kanye as God King. In the refrain of his song, Odyssey says, I know that Jesus was a mortal man, and Hove, referring to Jay-Z, ain't Jehovah, just a normal man. We all lambs to the slaughter, we all die, but some die harder. At the end of that refrain, he also includes, on the definition of a martyr, let my name live on, as the king without a throne with all the honor. Here we hear Odyssey stress the need to properly situate mortality as central to the human experience, even as one attempts to reach the pinnacle of artistic production. More to the point, though, he emphasizes the theological dissonance at work in declaring one's own supremacy, whether via artistic prowess or even declaring oneself as God, figuratively or otherwise. In echoing points made in Yassine Bey's intervention regarding a similar ethos, Odyssey seems to ask what gets lost in the failure to realize human limitation and walk honestly in one's shortcomings. His track is not really meant as a diss record, as much as it functions as a moment of reflection regarding what happens when fans worship or glorify famous artists. Nonetheless, discussing this album with other listeners has reminded me not to merely dismiss what Kanye has produced, as I like to consider what can be salvaged here. There are aspects of his theological musings that do seem unintelligible, but I am not sure if we should read what he has crafted as mere religious and historical ignorance. In pushing past my own immediate reading of Kanye's testimony as self-concerned and confused, I find his willingness to testify interesting, and am encouraged to lean into that vulnerability that informs his output. And by the critical honesty, it seems, poured from this I was lost, but now that I have found that I was lost claim. Now, it is certainly a self-righteous exercise, but in being generous, maybe too generous, I wonder if we might view this latest direction as part of his spiritual evolution. Perhaps what we have been given is evidence of an unfinished growth in earnest, of a tortured soul in motion. As such, we should be mindful that personal spiritual discovery is not always pretty, and that personal reckoning is messy, even messier when you attempt to do it in public. In trying to consider the theological, economic, social, and artistic implications of this music, we might understand that these releases are somehow informed by a conception of the divine as embodied, internal, immanent. But then what happens when the human interior is rife with entitlement or limited by emphasis on materialism? Perhaps in both testimonies, that is Jay Electronica and Kanye, we see a desire to inhabit, if not remake, the throne, as it were. Whereas some artists, such as Yasin Bey, who was a Black Sunni Muslim, have critiqued the act of throne seeking for its utter inability to be an inclusive model for human life and progress. Jay-Z and Kanye, for example, only wish to tear down any thrones they encounter, so they may be rebuilt in their own image. They take no immediate issue with the notion of a throne, maybe because they're wealthy and they already have access to it, except for the idea of their own exclusion. And so prior references to basketball via corporate ownership and participation and other forms of play, that is sex, dance, leisure, international travel, for example, illustrate a worldly view of material consumption as part of a larger game that results in economic and ultimately political autonomy for Jay and Kanye, who intend to dominate, control, and win. For others, perpetual dispossession reveals that these modes of consumption, regardless of who is consuming, are injurious to most people who cannot participate in games of consumption at the level that throne sitters do. On the other hand, what Jay and Kanye display is an attempt to turn their attention not toward the hip hop world alone, but they're also in dialogue or seek to dialogue with other spheres of influence, with the world beyond hip hop, toward the world of the exclusive super rich. Jay and Kanye are thus in dialogue with a material culture that is an exclusive world, and that is class-oriented as it is racially coded. While they taunt their new class peers at their inability to prevent their access with classic bravado, they also spend time boasting to those who do not have access to that world. Caught up in a game of representation, they not only include themselves in a world of luxury, they simultaneously display their wealth to those beyond it, thereby rehearsing exclusive practices. While this does complicate the notion that their testimony illustrates consumptive politics that at once seeks to refashion the order of things and simultaneously inscribe themselves into an old economic order while upholding or holding. We must remember that hip hop as a dialogical tradition has always been imbricated with this contradiction. And so I play another clip for you.
It makes it easier to bear. Yeah. You won't regret it, no, no. Young girls, they don't forget it. Love is their home, happiness, yeah. Sweet, sweet.
Sounds so soulful, don't you agree? I invented sweat, popping bottles, putting supermodels in the cab. Proof, I guess I got my swagger back. Truth, new watch alert, new blows. Or the big face rollie, I got two of those. Arm out the window through the city, I maneuver slow. Cock back, snap back, see my cut through the hole.
And one of their more well-known songs from their 2013 Watch the Throne album, perhaps the most emblematic scene in Jay and Kanye's music video for Otis, is situated at its outset as the two slowly stride toward a Maybach, that is a $500,000 automobile. An uber example of super wealth, they nonchalantly approach with tools in hand. Kanye carrying a circular saw, that is to cleave the symbolic power of exclusive wealth from its foundational representation of top-tier luxury. And at the same time, Jay carrying the blowtorch, that is to fuse their own identities onto that symbolic power. While Jay turns back with what be read as a look of playful disgust or intentional indifference, all against the backdrop of Otis Redding crooning, "It makes it easier to bear, you won't regret it," in his song, Try Little Tenderness. Otis Redding's song was itself a 1966 rendition of the original, written in 1932 by white American and British songwriters, and was performed by Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, among others. It signifies, in my mind, a soulful reconstruction of what we can suppose was originally intended for white audiences, a reordering of consumptive power relations. In other words, that which was designed and constructed for white consumption was remade for Black popular consumption, except it no longer followed its original tenor. Its top was chopped off, its tinted windows and unidirectional glass parts cast aside, and nitrogen thrust was affixed to its body in order to appeal to an audience that longed for the faster pace of rhythm and blues. Forever changed and inextricably altered, the object of an inaccessible consumption no longer holds any resemblance of exclusivity, that is to throne seekers, and its associations are attributed to a Black representational force. Even the American flag in front of which they perform their consumption is an altered one. In Otis, Jay and Kanye, for example, offer a double entendre that articulates a resistance to being marginalized by both spatial and economic forms of power. At once, they voice a disdain for the structurally exclusive practices historically utilized to perpetuate the dispossession suffered by people of color domestically, both native and immigrant. One more recent example of this logic of capitalist power gone awry is seen through Jay-Z's partnership with the National Football League. Rather than maintain the fidelity to the political protest of Colin Kaepernick, we see a choice to work within the confines of power in order to reorder them. This would not be an act of abolition, but a pragmatism toward public progress that perhaps subverted freedom itself. This choice to work against the prior strategy of protest perhaps represents a disavowal of proletarian grammar of liberty. In the midst of such impulses, I wonder what good the gospel of prosperity does for those of us who can't, quote unquote, buy at the block. It's not that in considering what testimony achieves in both Jay Electronica and Kanye West's albums that I seek to question the validity of their religious voices. Similarly, I'm not so much interested in drawing lines around the sacred and profane. I do find the intersections of artistic expression, faith, and Black identities interesting. It is possible that the border where the sacrosanct and the sacrilegious meet might offer something radically new to the spiritually downtrodden. It is at this juncture, right, between faith, in this case, Christianity and Islam, and the mundane, that offers a seeming paradox, not unlike the inception of hip hop culture itself. We should remember that hip hop has always been a paradox, a something from people considered nothings, a source of life and momentum that emerged from a necropolitical foundation, a resounding boom that arose from the voiceless, that is a revolutionary laughter, and Lux life tucked into the crevices of under-resourced communities. Moreover, it's fair to note that in spite of his critique, Yassine Bey, for example, has worked in the past with Kanye West, Jay-Z, and Jay Electronica. In trying to make sense of the theological offering that emerges from these musics, it seems that both albums preach a prosperity gospel in which the devout are rewarded with material success, and beyond that, an assumption that the wealthy have divine favor. Yet I wonder to what use to the poor is a theology that does not strive to make itself widely accessible. Perhaps Kanye perhaps seeks to engage in a theological refashioning of his own and on his own terms. I wonder if his Jesus is King album is an iteration of what he did to that Maybach, except now he wants to take his circular saw to the roof of the Christian church. It could be that he is hacking his own religion, except some would argue that he isn't quite ready for the graceful carpentry it might take to build a better and truer engagement with the walk to God. There may be space to consider the worth of a faith in one's material wealth as it provides certain immediate latitudes, but shiny suit revivalism, I imagine, has its limits. Perhaps the most important role that the Black church and the Black mosque have historically played in the lives of their congregants is, in essence, personal transformation alongside collective uplift. Movements like the Nation of Islam have offered Black Muslims, in particular, a vision of self-determined entrepreneurship and material prosperity in the 1930s and beyond. Meanwhile, Black Methodist and Baptist church communities have operated as mutual aid networks for economically vulnerable Black folk since before the Emancipation Proclamation. However, their most valuable impact has not necessarily been their ability to provide valuable goods, but to assist Black congregants with amassing internal value, particularly for a people whose ancestors were once property and thus devalued. A closer examination of Malcolm X's analysis of revolution in his 1963 address gives us room to pause and reflect, as my critique of Kanye West's revivalist approach does not necessarily mean that I conclude that the core of Jay Electronica's theology is radically different to that of the gospel of Kanye. In that same speech, Malcolm made clear what it would take to see actual measurable change in the way of societal improvement, nothing short of revolution. To him, revolution was not found in compromise, nor was it found in merely widening access to problematic social structures. He said, unquote, "Revolution is bloody. Revolution is hostile. Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way," unquote. In similar fashion, one particular Lord has reminded us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Especially when Malcolm X was its national spokesperson under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, and now even under the leadership of Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam has consistently identified American racial capitalism as inherently problematic. Ultimately, the conclusions I have regarding Kanye's theological turn is similar to my conclusions of Jay Electronica's theological offering. In spite of their claims toward uplift, neither seems invested in any substantive dismantling of the uneven relations of power that produce Black suffering. Moreover, both Jay Elect and Kanye's respective theological offerings seem somewhat askew in light of the traditions they claim to be inspired by. As Vincent Lloyd tells us in his reflections on Black tradition, theological transmission functions discontinuously insofar as Messianic religion works deeply in the rupture between past and present in order to envision a radically different future. More directly, Black Messianic religiosity should not be confused with the prophetic, in which elitism and exclusion do not offer profound transformation in spite of a commitment to the good and the generational transfer of wisdom. In his book, Religion of the Field Negro, Lloyd says, prophecy is about continuity, discerning the values of the past, showing how they mismatch the present, and pointing to the consequences of that mismatch for the future. The consequences could be good, reaching the land of milk and honey, or they could be dire, fire and brimstone, if the mismatch persists. Meanwhile, he says further, the Messianic in contrast is about discontinuity, about those elements of the past that do not fit into historical narratives, and those elements of the future that are not thinkable in the present. From the perspective of the Messianic, there is no clear path here to the land of milk and honey, but there is work to do, the work of preparing ourselves for when the Messiah arrives, whenever that may be. This preparatory work includes cleansing ourselves of all that distorts our souls. Politically, the Messianic is open to revolution, to the world being turned upside down. Moreover, while prophecy is practiced by the elite and consumed by the masses, the Messianic names a practice accessible to the masses, a practice of preparation for radical transformation, end quote. Admittedly, I'm still grappling with how to fully understand the implications of the testimony that Kanye and Jay Electronica and Jay-Z give us. On the one hand, their gospel potentially represents a break or rupture with the prophetic, in spite of their self-understanding as exceptional. For Kanye, the divine is embodied in the person of the kingly Jesus. Nonetheless, while drawing on the sonic grammar of the Black church, he brings to bear the limits of ecclesiastical authority and suggests an aversion for idolatry in spite of his apparent fixation with positioning himself as a disciple worthy of spreading the good word. Jay Electronica's struggle with the earthly vices and brandishing of the secular, however, render him an outlier in the face of the militaristic respectability that NOI membership commands, aside from the fact that he's romantically connected to a Rothschild. In the midst of this paradox, his testimony yields a warning of divine reckoning against the backdrop of racial persecution, the warning of an impending fire in the sense that James Baldwin foretold. Yet I'm not confident that this places their theology into the realm of the Messianic, considering their hyper-materialism and investment in the dunya, this dunya. While the Prophet Muhammad enforced the redistribution of wealth amongst his companions to the benefit of the poor, seeking to put money in their hands, but not in their hearts, Jesus the Christ is known for having been angered by witnessing money changers conducting their business in the place of worship. In Islamic perspective, the return of Jesus, the Messiah, foretells of a radical break with the antecedent realm of disbelief and oppression in order to corral humanity into a proper conception in regard for divine justice. A written testimony and Jesus is King, I would argue, are not apocalyptic in their vision. These respective routes to uplift do not entail the ending of a world, nor the building of a new one. Being generous, the gospel of Kanye might provide commentary on the transformation of a prior self and the religious institutions that seemingly do not have a place for him, but ultimately does not call for us to leave any and all remnants of the prior material world behind. In order to follow Jesus and enter the kingdom, according to Kanye, one does not necessarily have to confront the structures of power that inhibit expansive dignity and human flourishing. I have no graceful way to end here, but I find it interesting that we are currently audience to what seems like ongoing plagues that are a consequence of our capacity for heedlessness. Hurricanes, flooding, fire, wanton murder, racist violence, global disease, and so on. I therefore quote Yasin Bey, who composed a direct rejoinder to Kanye and Jay-Z's celebration of the throne back in 2013. In a song entitled Niggas and Poorest, he says, to the kings and queens and everyone in every place, don't get caught up in the throne. Towers of Babylon rise up, and so they shall fall, as it was written before. Amen. The show goes on. Don't get caught up in no throne. These devils out here lying, acting like the people ain't dying. The silver and the gold ain't never saved a soul. Don't get caught up in no throne. Shout out to the earth and to the heavens, lunar, solar eclipses. We're seeking for forgiveness and safety for our children. Don't get caught up in no throne. Allah is in control. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop here to open up space for Q&A. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to go ahead and stop share.
Well, thank you very much, Youssef. This has been very refreshing. You know, I think your comparative approach to the issue of music, you know, in the expression of both Christian and, you know, Muslim religiosity and faith in general has been very, very inspiring for all of us. So I'll just ask if there are any questions. Let's see.
I see a pretty significant one in the chat box.
Okay. So Alejandro, thanking you for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and especially your use of musical samples. Could you say something about your choice of Electronica and Kanye West? Are there other artists you want to consider? Do you think you will? Are you going to interact with more explicitly political theology rappers like Lecrae, Immortal Technique, etc., etc.? That's your question.
All right. Great. No, great question. So at first, disclaimer, I don't identify as a hip hop scholar, right? There are people that do that better than I do, better than I could do. But I will say that I find that these albums in particular, I was sort of drawn to these albums in particular because of their messaging and because of the way in which there's certain sort of themes with regards to freedom and slavery, but also interesting sort of analogies and metaphors around the throne, right? Around questions of power, around questions of kingship, right? That I think sort of bounce off of each other in interesting ways. And these sort of different, couched in sort of very different theologies, or couched, I should say, couched in different faith traditions, but perhaps ascribed to a similar theology. A theology that is potentially capitalist, a theology that sort of runs counter to both the messianic, but also maybe runs counter to the prophetic. Now, with regard to Lecrae, Immortal Technique, right? I mean, you also have other folks like that I mentioned, Odyssey, Yasin Bey, right? That have very captivating and interesting music. But this is just sort of one snippet of a larger conversation that could be had, right? I mean, you know, I spent a lot of time talking as it is, and I couldn't even go fully into all of what each album offered. I do have an intention to produce an article from these reflections, but there's no way that I can sort of encapsulate all of that into one body of writing, right? I mean, this, you know, one could write up, people are writing books on this stuff, but
right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a second question, but I just wanted to say something, and in relation to, you know, this point that you just made. So speaking from my own perspective as a researcher, I agree with you on the fact that the Islamization of hip hop, or its gospelization, because that's the term that Kanye West uses in his album, gospel album, that's what he calls it, does not forcibly cancel the consumerist aspect of that genre, which is hip hop. That's true, you know? But I think I wonder if there's not something that this gospelization of hip hop or its Islamization, if there's not something that it does, which makes it, I wouldn't say effective, but at least useful, right, in the way we address very urgent issues such as the capitalist breakdown, right? So, and many of these rappers, African-American rappers from the very beginning, they are members of most of them are 5%ers. And you touch on, so Prodigy, Immortal Technique, Method Man. So the 5%er ideology was sort of embedded in this anti-hegemonic discourse that they were trying to produce, which led many scholars of hip hop, not just in the US, to talk about the existence of a hip hop ummah, right? Or Islamic hip hop, as a response to that failure of capitalism to produce a functional, livable social model. So I was wondering if there's not something that these gospelizations do and which we should also pay attention to and maybe give some importance to. Yeah.
I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, yes. So there's something that these testimonies are doing, right? Because these do claim a certain kind of, there's the language of gospel. There's the language of the sort of testimony of faith, right? And in both of these works. With regard to the 5%er sort of approach, at least, let's say 80s and 90s, golden age of hip hop. One of the things that we see with, like, say, groups like Poor Righteous Teachers and Brand Nubian, we see articulations of uplift that would work outside or beyond the confines of power, right? These, however, don't claim to do that, in spite of the fact that Jay-Z, I guess, is associated with the 5%ers, right? He's working within the confines of power. Now, there is something to be said about a sort of a pragmatic approach to progress. But I cannot I'm not sure that I can entirely untether that from his sort of capitalist maneuvering, right? This is something to be consumed, right? There's a manner in which, I mean, there's a manner in which Jesus is King, for example. I find it interesting that the entirety of the album is it takes less than half an hour to get through, right? It's interesting that only 2 years prior, much to my surprise, he wrote a song entitled, "I Thought About Killing You Today." Yeah. And several years prior, he's out here talking about "I Am a God," right? So what happens in the several years from 2013 to now, right? Where all of a sudden he's this sort of saved and redeemed person that then claims to offer this path of this walk, right, for other people, right? Making claims such as, when I get to heaven's gates, I don't have to peek over, right? What does that mean, right? That doesn't sound like a humble, reflective walk to me, right? I have to admit, when the album first came out, I mean, I don't identify as a Christian. I'm a Muslim, but I offended on the part of Christians, right? I don't know. I mean, there was and again, that's not to say that I also wanted to sort of lean and push past my own discomfort in order to sort of look closer, right? There's something happening here. I'm not sure that I understand it all, right? I think that one has to sit with it longer. I'm not entirely sure if I'm willing to, but I would have to if I am going to write this article. But we'll see. There are other sort of questions in there, but yeah.
I definitely get your point. Let's move to the next. So would you say something in regards to the function testimony serves in religious communities and the implications of Electronica and presenting these works as testimonies?
Yeah, if I can speak to that, I mean, so there's other things that sort of need to be considered that I haven't sort of fleshed out. So the way in which testimony operates alongside Semitic language in both of these works. So on the part of Jay Electronica, what does Arabic do, right? For Kanye, what does Hebrew do, right? Uttering the terms hallelujah, etc., right? And there's a way in which, in both of these albums, there's different racial coding, I think, or differential racial coding. And again, both of these albums should not, or at least for me, both of these albums can't be divorced from or untethered from the speaker, right? And those speakers have very public movements in which, and sort of economic calculations at the same time, right? Talking about kingship, the manner in which, when Jay Electronica's album first came out and I heard that sort of Jay-Z is all over it, my immediate thought was, okay, is Jay-Z attempting to wrestle back his race card, right? From this sort of fiasco with the NFL, is he like trying to engage in this game of a kind of cultural legitimacy, right? To win back the hearts and minds of the community part of the community that sort of was raised on Jay-Z, right? When I had this conversation with friends about this very question, and some folks are real defensive. I have a friend who's from Brooklyn who, I had to we had to kind of hash it out a little bit, because to him, Jay-Z presents a model for sort of making it out of, a dire situation, economically speaking. But that model, as I sort of stressed to him, is not one that's sustainable and not one that's accessible for everybody. So as I said in the presentation, what do we do? What do people do when they can't buy up the block, right? When they can't engage in the sort of capitalist maneuvering, right? Aside from the fact that those very same structures produce Black suffering, right? Revolution this is not, right? In spite of the fact that Kanye, in part of his album, he talks about, we have the tools, we have the youth, yada, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as if what he's doing is a movement, but a movement that is heading in what direction is my question, right? This is not abolition. This is not apocalypse, right? This is not reckoning. Right? We're not talking about dismantling a problematic world. We're talking about stepping into and assimilating and integrating into a problematic world. So,
great. I think the rest is another comment. Let's see if we do have maybe some time for one question. There's a lot of appreciative comments, of course. Right here. Dr. Carter, do you see yourself tackling similar topics in other genres of music, such as metal, jazz, or rock?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I have to sort of get this other book done. This book done, right? The one I'm working on African American and West African, hence Black Atlantic Sufism. But we'll see. There is a way in which Sufism and the question of music is sort of a rich conversation that I don't see myself staying away from. But yeah, the question of African American Islam and hip hop is a rich field that I think begs more study. So, you have folks like Richard Brent Turner, who's working on jazz music, right? And has written widely on African American Islam. And as a matter of fact, he has a book called Jazz Religion, which I would encourage people to take a look at. And sort of a last conversation, he was talking through the sort of Islamic influences in John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme" as part of his work. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not really a metalhead,
Yeah, right.
so maybe not. But we'll see.
So, well, this is great. We are almost running out of time, but I'm very much tempted to ask you this so that, you know, you may have thoughts. And that's because I wanted to push you a little bit on your comparativistic approach to, you know, music in religion. So, you know, when I heard about your talk, I was reminded of a lot of things, you know. So, and then I went back to my discography. I enjoyed Kanye West's Hurtless back in 2008. For some of you who didn't know, this is a side of me. I used to enjoy hip hop a lot back in Senegal. So there is definitely that materialistic aspect in Kanye, Kanye's music, you know, at that time. But what I see with this album is that he has been able, at least with choirs, right, to adapt its performance, right? So at least give a choir performance, you know, a meaning to the album. But if you go to West Africa, for example, or in the Muslim world in general, so when Youssef, for example, made that album in which he praised Islamic leaders, he was not actually even using the traditional sexually very elusive sort of music, but he used a different genre. But he was told, no, you can't do that. So do you have any thoughts about the permissibility of music in Christian spheres, and not the same case, you know, in Islamic spheres? So
yeah, I mean, you know, so I think what's interesting is the manner in which sort of the field of music, in this case, the genre of hip hop, right, provides a kind of sort of pocket in which that which is held up as the sacred, right, and the profane sort of come together, and what gets produced out of that merging. What becomes possible when you sort of bring these, sort of erase the line between the sacrosanct and the sacrilegious? I'm not sure, but I just sort of merely trying to sort of think about why these musics are so deeply and richly theological, why the sort of religiosity sort of flowers out of it, regardless of how problematic we might think that sort of production is. You know, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Kanye's sort of use of gospel, I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, granted, there's a sort of an emotive, nostalgic quality to what he's doing, but I'm not sure if it's dangerous. Rather than think of him as the Messiah, right? Could he be the anti-Messiah? Could he be the Antichrist, right? Insofar as is he leading people toward Jesus? Is he leading people away from Jesus, right? In terms of, if we understand Jesus the Christ, right? Because, you know, I juxtapose, and I was talking to other friends about this, and my wife as well. You know, there's a contrast between what Kanye's doing, his vision of Jesus, and the vision of Jesus that is apparent in Gregory Porter's song, "Take Me to the Alley," right? Where Kanye's Jesus sort of claims kingship in this sort of earthly throne. Gregory Porter's Jesus sort of refuses the throne, refuses the halls of power, and says, take me to the alley, take me to those that are suffering, take me to those who are downtrodden, and let me sort of care for them, right? It's a very different engagement of Jesus. That's the Jesus that I was sort of raised to understand, and as a Muslim have sort of understand a little bit more thoroughly, or you know, in a different way. This sort of kingly Jesus that wears the crown, that sort of claims lordship in a sort of human sense, is not one that I recognize, right? But again, you know, not wanting to insert my own understanding onto that, but you know, I also put that in the conversation with the sort of the very sort of pragmatic marketing and consumption strategy for this album. I mean, you know, where's this, you know, we're going to talk about gospel music and the sort of the joyful noise, but where's the sermon, right? Where's the substance, right? Is this Christianity emptied of meaning and emptied of efficacy, right? I don't know, which is why I use the term mumble theology, right? I was going to use the term house Negro theology, but I don't know. I was told that might be a little harsh and problematic. But yeah.
Well,
and I would apply this sort of same idea to Jay Electronica, right? This kind of, and somebody mentioned this sort of being confused about this paradox, right? In both Jay Elect and Kanye, right? Yes, that paradox is there, but I think that comes with the territory. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think this has been a wonderful talk. A lot of questions and comments here, but we've run out of time. We thank you again, Dr. Carter, for your time, and also for putting in a lot of energy into explaining this complex music religion nexus to us. Thank you very much again. I enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat for folks who want to reach out. Once again, thank you so much for having me and for indulging me in sharing these reflections. I really was excited about the opportunity to share my thoughts. So thank you so much.